I'm going to be joined by a number of my Senate colleagues to talk about reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. We have many that are very concerned that we need to move this reauthorization, and so they'll be joining me here today. The first chart we're putting up here, Mr. President, this is Hannah Harris, who was a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. Here she is with her son just months before she was brutally murdered on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Hannah was all of 21 years old and her son only 10 months old. We now honor Hannah and all murdered and Indigenous women and girls each year on Hannah's birthday, May 5th, as a national day of awareness. It is fitting to remember and honor these women and girls, and it's critical we understand the magnitude of violence that Native women face. 84% of Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. That's 4 out of 5. In some tribal communities, Native women are murdered at rates more than 10 times the national average. 10 times. 1 out of 3 Native women has been raped. Behind these statistics are thousands of faces, thousands of lives disrupted, shattered, and cut short. Faces like that of Ashley Loring Heavy Runner. This is a photo of Ashley. Ashley was an outgoing 20-year-old Native college student during the summer of 2017 when she went missing on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Last December, I heard firsthand about the devastating impact of Ashley's disappearance when her sister, Kimberly Loring Heavy Runner, came before the Indian Affairs Committee to ask Congress to take action. Kimberly told us, and I quote here what Kimberly said, "We are going missing. We are being murdered. I am here to stress to you, we are loved and we are missed. We will no longer be invisible people. We have worth." That's Kimberly talking. By the end of 2017, the FBI had identified 5,600 additional cases of missing Native women and girls. This number is likely a very, very severe undercount. This crisis is devastating Native families across the country. Mr. President, it's unacceptable. Just last week, the Senate passed a resolution remembering murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And I thank you to Senator Daines and other Republicans for sponsoring this bipartisan resolution. But now we must make good on those words. We must walk the walk. We must take bipartisan action to end the cycle of violence. And we should start by reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act and strengthening provisions to protect Native women. I've been a strong proponent of VAWA from the beginning, and I pushed hard for the law's passage in 1994 when I was New Mexico's Attorney General. But it became clear early on that VAWA's provisions weren't reaching tribal communities because of the tribal jurisdictional maze put in place by a 1978 U.S. Supreme Court decision. In Oliphant versus Squamish Indian tribe, the court held that Indian tribes cannot exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit crimes on reservations. This ruling undermined the sovereign right of tribes to enforce the law on tribal lands. It undercut public safety in Indian country, and it let violent offenders escape prosecution. An astounding number of violent crimes against Native women on reservations are committed by non-Indians. According to the National Institute of Justice, 97% of Native women who experience violence in their lifetime have been victimized by non-Indian perpetrators. But while tribal authorities' hands were tied, federal law enforcement authorities weren't addressing these cases either. Investigations were not pursued because the crimes took place in remote locations. Federal prosecutors declined to prosecute cases. Crimes against Native women and children were pushed to the back burner. The inability of tribes to protect their own members was an inexcusable hole in the law. By the time the Senate took up VAWA reauthorization in 2012 and 2013, we could no longer ignore Oliphant. We could no longer ignore that Oliphant left Native women at risk. In the Senate, I fought to restore tribes' authority to provide for the safety for their members, and we ultimately reinstated their authority to prosecute anyone who commits domestic violence on a reservation through VAWA 2013. Since then, 18 tribes have begun exercising jurisdiction over domestic violence crimes. There have been 143 arrests of 128 violent offenders with 74 convictions to date. This is a real step in the right direction. But with time and experience, tribes have seen there are still gaps that must be closed to stop violence against Native women. Tribes have identified 4 changes Congress must make to hold violent offenders accountable. First, tribal jurisdiction under VAWA doesn't extend to domestic violence against children. If a Native child is caught up in the violence, or as is too often the case, tribal law enforcement can't prosecute the offender. We have to change that. Second, VAWA only applies to domestic violence. It doesn't apply to general cases of sexual assault, sex trafficking, or stalking. Like other types of violence, Native women face higher levels of sexual violence than other women in the U.S. In fact, of the Native women who have experienced violence, 56% have experienced sexual violence. Yet VAWA 2013 didn't cover the entire range of sexual violence directed toward Native women. Congress must fix this. Third, VAWA 2013 wasn't clear whether tribes have jurisdiction over attempted domestic violence. If a perpetrator swings at his spouse and misses, there's no crime until the next time when he lands a punch. We must fix this loophole, or Native women will continue to be at risk. And finally, VAWA doesn't cover crimes committed against tribal law enforcement officers charged with responding to domestic violence. So if an officer is responding to a domestic violence case and he or she is assaulted, they aren't covered under the law. And so that needs to be fixed. Domestic violence calls, as all of us know, are some of the most dangerous law enforcement responds to. Police officers, including tribal officers, are assaulted when responding to disturbance calls more than any other circumstance. Yet tribes can't protect their own officers. These gaps in VAWA undermine the very purpose of the law and put children, women, and police officers at great risk. We must remedy this. Senators Murkowski and Smith and I have introduced the Native Youth and Tribal Officer Protection Act to ensure tribes can exercise jurisdiction to prosecute crimes against children and tribal officers and attempted domestic violence. The bipartisan bill is supported by 16 former U.S. attorneys appointed under Republican and Democratic administrations, and the Indian Law and Order Commission, a body of tribal public safety experts established under the bipartisan Tribal Law and Order Act. We have also introduced the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act, which makes sure that tribes have authority to prosecute sexual assault, sex trafficking, and stalking crimes. The House of Representatives already passed these measures last month on a bipartisan basis as part of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2019. It is now our turn to take action. We cannot allow this bill to be buried in the majority leader's so-called legislative graveyard, not when women's lives are literally at stake. Friends, we must all agree it is long past time to address violence against women in Indian country. I urge this body to reauthorize VAWA and pass the Native Youth and Tribal Officer Protection Act and Justice for Native Survivors Act. Let the families of Hannah and Ashley and thousands of other missing and murdered Native women know that they are not invisible, that they have worth, and that they deserve justice.